What we're going to be talking about this morning is the results of the third Gilbert F. White Forum on flood policy, and that topic was on flood risk. But before we get into that, I want to just talk briefly about the foundation for those who are not familiar, and today at lunch you'll be learning more. But basically the ASFPM Foundation is an extension of ASFPM. It's dedicated to raising funds to support education and research for flood loss reduction. And some efforts you might be familiar with would be the flood forums, the flood manager game, publications, provided funding to support CFM initiatives as well as no adverse impact. The third forum itself was supported by these sponsors. And if you have a chance to thank these sponsors when you see them, please do, because amongst this group, they raised almost $90,000 or over $90,000 to support the forum itself, just for these three series events, which is a significant input. On top of that, there was probably countless hours of time dedicated in terms of volunteer input. Now, the forum itself was named after Gilbert F. White, who many of us know, and the forum is the foundation's signature event. It's a periodic gathering of experts. So every 2 to 3 years, we pull together roughly 100 experts to discuss an issue of significant flood policy. It's a national discussion of important floodplain management issues, and it was named after Gilbert White, the most influential floodplain management policy expert of the 20th century. The forums are not only a tribute to Gilbert's work, but it's a recognition of the success of his deliberative approach to policy analysis and research. And right now, in terms of, I think, some of the best presentation you could talk about is just what Dennis Milletti just did in terms of the informed, deliberative, thoughtful research that should be put forth in these areas. And that's part of what we're trying to embody when we do these forums. Now, going into the forum event itself, and to kind of get you into the thought process of where we were with the design, I want to do a little bit of an exercise here. Okay, with this exercise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a word, and when I say that word, I want you to think and envision whether you have a common understanding of that word with the person next to you, or perhaps with anyone else in this room. Okay, ready? Okay, the word's religion. Okay, how many of you think you have a common understanding of what that word is with everyone else in this room? Okay, the second demonstration is the next word, flood risk. That's the problem. Goes back to what Dennis was saying, is that when we start to coin and we start to talk about this term flood risk, we have thrown it around rather loosely, and if you go back in and you look at how it's being applied, it's being used in a variety of different ways across the nation. The design of the forum itself was to pull the people together that were really debating and discussing flood risk and trying to see if we could come up with some common understanding and begin to narrow the range of what flood risk and flood risk management is all about, and develop definitions for the future. To do that, though, it was a very complex undertaking. Unlike our previous forums, we decided that we needed to have 2 preparatory symposium, more of a technical nature, before we got into the forum itself. Okay, the first symposium was defining and measuring flood risk and floodplain resources. And that occurred in September 2009. At that forum itself, we had roughly 70 to 80 experts that tried to talk about what is our definition of flood risk and what should be included when we discuss flood risk. Symposium 2 was held in November 2009 in the Washington, D.C. area on flood risk perception, communication, and behavior, really drawing upon the work of Dr. Milletti and others to begin to talk about what are we doing to be able to try and adapt behavior. As an adjunct to that meeting, we also pulled together what was a formative meeting of the Natural Resources Alliance to begin to talk about how do we bring natural resource functions into this topic of risk. And then we had the forum itself just this past March on managing flood risk. And the point of this forum is that it's good to talk about flood risk management as a quantification technique, but it's until we begin to talk about managing flood risk, that's when we have something. So some of the questions that we debated over this series and some of the things that we posed to the group to think about was, has a century of work in flood protection resulted in an outcome that we would wish to continue into the future? Well, the first observation is that as a nation, water resource development has been our de facto floodplain and coastal policy for nearly a century, And the question we need to think about within the forum, but also within this conference is, will this policy approach be satisfactory for the future? This is a very contemporary topic as you start to understand what's being debated with the revised principles and guidelines, and it's something that's going to be on the minds of people as we craft and prepare for the next 50 to 100 years of flood protection policy. Question number 2, should we be concerned about the extent and condition of our floodplain and coastal resources? Now this topic is almost, when you think about what's happening in the Gulf Coast, it almost begins to exacerbate what we're talking about here from flood risk management in terms of other disasters. But the first observation is that the ability of floodplain resources to provide fisheries, clean water habitat, and other functions for our future is in question. And the thing is what adjustments are necessary to ensure our resources are sufficient for the future. I would characterize it this way. We talk about water resources development for advancing our economy, but if you go back and you talk to a traditional resource economist, what is the foundation of our economy? It's not necessarily the sticks and bricks that are out there, but it's the land, the soil, the water, the forest, the other factors that build our economy. And it's time that we begin to think about that interaction as we craft this policy. Jackie Mundy and myself, in support of the forum, prepared this paper that was in the ASFPM News and Views, the need for resource conservation ethic and flood risk management. And in there, we suggested that we needed to maintain sight of the dual policy role of floodplain management as we talk about flood risk management, that being the loss reduction along with natural resource management and protection. We need to recognize the importance of these resources to our economy, as I suggested previously. And we began to identify in there, are we at the cusp of advances in floodplain management that were no different than what we were facing with forestry and agronomy policy of the early 1900s. The Forest Service came about because we had destroyed our forests. Many of the practices of USDA for our farms came about because of soil erosion problems related to that. And we need to begin to wonder, are we at the same point as it relates to our water and water-related resources? And we also suggested that there's a need to expand flood risk management to be more than just flooding risk, but include risk to the floodplain resources. The question we posed to the group was, how do we craft a flood risk and resource management policy and strategy that will make a difference in human behavior? Again, following up on the research from Dennis. Well, first, what we're finding is that individuals and policymakers simply do not understand or choose to ignore flood risks or threats to our resources. And I need to explain these pictures right here. My family was on vacation in Cape Cod. We were out by a lighthouse, and a group of tourists came up, and while we were standing well back using a zoom lens, they all went around and stood by the sign for danger, sliding cliffs, keep back. It became quite the thing that they wanted to try and get their picture by. And again, it's a matter of that, are we really reaching these people in terms of signs, in terms of warnings, in terms of really educating people on their behavior? Question 4, how do we adapt to a changing world in terms of changes in climate, populations, and economies? In our Forum 2050, we pointed out the fact that not only are we facing a changing climate, but you look at populations in the United States. We're talking about adding 20, 30, 40 million people over the course of the next century. Significant impacts in terms of what's going to be, of the impacts that could have on flood risk. But we also know that we traditionally are much better at planning based on past history versus forecasting with many unknowns. And that's an area we're going to have to be much better about in order to be able to plan, to be able to figure out and begin to think about how do we adapt to some of these future unknowns, and perhaps how do we set ourselves aside perhaps from some of the noise of the debate to be able to make conscious decisions in terms of how we move forward for the future. And flood risk management and resource has broad implications, and that's the important fact. First off is with a flood risk management strategy, it's very positive because it introduces the notion of a risk continuum versus at risk or not at risk. And again, if you start to think about the behavioral research that's out there, perhaps that could be a very important finding of this notion of risk continuum. It's not a matter of that you're not at risk, you're just at different levels, and perhaps that's not all that important in the communication. A flood risk management resource strategy should allow the ability to benchmark and monitor risk at various levels. It's a matter of that this would open the door for us perhaps to begin to identify, are we trending in the right direction as it relates to risk in the nation? It opens the door for considering and communicating a series of actions that increase or decrease risk. And to be effective must be inclusive of a variety of uses and functions within floodplains and coastal areas.